Okay, now we will have Carol Murchison, she, her, with Breaking the Silence, Legal Pathways and Survival Power in Buddhist Communities. Miss Carol Murchison has been called the cult assassin and the Wonder Woman of taking down cults. I love that. She is a seasoned attorney turned cult litigator who has brought legal action against some of the world's most revered spiritual leaders and organizations. She now leads a team of lawyers dedicated to fighting spiritual misconduct at the law firm McAllister Oliveris. Previously, she was a partner of the Philadelphia office of Morgan Lewis, where she conducted dozens of workplace investigations at Fortune 50 companies. It's a big, big pleasure to have you on the 5th International Queer Buddhist Conference. It's your stage, Carol.
Thank you so much. It's just wonderful to be here and to have heard Anne and Amy's presentation about kind of where we have been in these last 7 years. In any case, I want to start by acknowledging how much courage there is both in this space here today and for people who are watching via the internet, how much courage it takes to address this topic. So, Jampa, many thanks to you for your courage and your work in sponsoring the conference. For Anne and Amy to take on this topic and to continue with the research and the contribution that that's going to make. Obviously, we have the courage of survivors, allies. They're allies. Somebody once told me that 10,000 people were chanting for my death in India. And I was not particularly worried about that since I'm still, alive and kicking. But I know that some of the threats that people receive are very frightening, in fact, and it takes courage to continue along the path. So to all of you, whether you are practitioners of Buddhism or who you are, that you are bringing, what you are bringing to the table, your race, your gender, your sexual identity, you're bringing all of these things together with hopefully the courage to be able to help us make Buddhism not a cult. So when I hear the words cult assassin, I think, well, people are going to think, well, does that mean Buddhism is a cult? Well, no, not necessarily. But cults are organizations that have charismatic, authoritarian leaders who cannot be disobeyed and who in effect are able to abuse their power. So in all of these situations that we've been talking about, that Anne and Amy went through, yes, in some of them could be called cults or high control, high demand groups. But for all of you here, both today and in the future, as people listen to this tape, we are part of a moment, I think, of truth telling. And so we've heard a bit about silence, about how Buddhist communities use silence to suppress truth. Rather than to, for example, deepen their understanding of the problem. The silence is not just the absence of speech or voice. It's the product of fear that is instilled in people. It is the product of a hierarchy that is unbending. It's the product of tradition and an unquestioned loyalty. So when I first began representing survivors of sexual abuse in Buddhism, and also other spiritual communities, by the way, because this is not necessarily just happening in Buddhist communities. In any case, I saw that silence everywhere. It's in teachers who tell students that they don't want to create bad karma by speaking up. Sangha members who whisper, well, you don't want to harm the Dharma, do you? In the survivors themselves who often loved their teachers, loved the Dharma and their practice, and didn't want to destroy a community that had once felt like home to them. So, today, in talking about breaking the silence, I want to talk about what happens when survivors actually speak. What happens when their allies actually speak. And so I want to give you a little bit of information about the legal pathways that exist, because after all, as you heard, I am a lawyer. So we only know one thing. I often tell people I only know one trick, and that is in the law. So let's talk about the legal pathways that exist when survivors are willing to tell their stories. And two, about what happens then that is often more powerful than the law, which is saying something, which is the collective strength that survivors gain to reclaim their own agency, their own story as true and no longer secret. So, how does silencing work in the Buddhist context? What does it look like? Well, for example, I give you a young woman that I'm aware of, a dedicated Buddhist student, when she reported that her teacher had raped her when she was incapacitated. She was told, well, that wasn't rape, that was just challenging your attachment. She tried to understand this, but ultimately she blamed herself, as many survivors do, for not being spiritually evolved enough. Eventually, after many years, she came to understand that she was assaulted. And she came to that understanding with the help of another survivor who was willing to give up being silent. This woman who was raped won a settlement against the teacher and the organization that enabled him, that was aware of his abuse and who did nothing. Another survivor came forward after years of abuse by a tantric teacher who told him that the sexual acts were a transmission. This man said to me later, I didn't even have the language to call it an assault. I thought that I had failed at enlightenment. But he too eventually broke his silence, and a support group formed around him to bring media attention to the organization's failure to protect him. Now, I want to stop here to say that my background has been in corporations, and you know, in talking about what moves them, it is money, and it is not a moral or ethical necessarily, kind of high understanding of those issues, but it is also money that moves in Buddhist communities that keeps these things silent. And when media brings attention, it causes failures in their money stream and actually has as much impact, or at least the potential for the same kind of impact that legal action takes, which is also about money. So, this silence is the terrain that many survivors of Buddhist sexual abuse live in. This is where they live, where spiritual authority is coercive and it distorts consent. And I want to say that again because coercion negates consent. This is a legal principle under the US human trafficking laws. When you are coerced, you cannot be giving consent. And where the tools of the Dharma, the tools of liberation, are being used to bind people instead of freeing them. So, why is that happening? Well, one of the reasons, and you've heard it already, comes from the structural hierarchies. In my view, from the legal perspective, teachers are being elevated beyond any accountability or responsibility. They simply cannot be disobeyed in many communities. So anything that a teacher does good or bad, right or wrong, can be justified as superior insight or enlightened action that's dedicated to the student's well-being. I I heard a woman speak just this week, in fact, about a book that she has out that is called, well, it's about spiritual trauma. So I can't remember the title. I'll send it to you, Jampa. But her research has been investigating the tremendous harm of spiritual trauma, not just being raped, not just being sexually assaulted. All of these things are wrapped up in something that is quite harmful, that is spiritual trauma. So the silencing that comes from this is especially traumatic to survivors. So why is that? Well, as I said, the teacher can't be disobeyed. The teacher cannot be found to be incorrect or wrong. So all of that means that there's a tremendously fertile ground for abuse of power. Boards are made up of, in my experience, 100% of people who are loyal and sometimes have signed loyalty oaths to the teacher. They are not independent. So there is very little real world thinking. And since it is disloyal to challenge the teacher cannot be wrong, and therefore the student cannot be right. Investigations, if done at all, are run internally rather than by neutral professionals, which is really worse than no investigation at all because the survivor has no chance of having their concerns validated when the so-called investigator cannot disobey, cannot be disloyal to the teacher. There is no option. So what happens? Well, I'm in a great position to talk about what happens, because what happens when survivors are not able to speak, when they've been harmed, when the Sangha turns its back, they seek lawyers. They seek lawyers because lawyers speak loudly. Even when we're using our inside voices, we have loud voices. We can go to court. We know how to try to advocate for these people. So they seek lawyers because every other avenue has been closed to them. They seek a lawyer who has the big stick of the law behind them. And the response from the Sangha is not, I can tell you, again, 100%. It is not, thank you for your courage. It is not, thank you for calling these things to our attention. We understand that they are illegal. No, it's when the lawyers come in, it's why bring lawyers into the Dharma? Couldn't you have handled this internally? And of course, the answer is no. So they bring lawyers because silence that is happening in Buddhist communities protects the wrong people. And because Buddhist communities exist like every other institution in a society that is governed by law. So spiritual power, spiritual beliefs, as well protected as they are in the United States, do not exempt anyone from legal accountability. And so this is something that many Buddhist communities, many boards of directors of Buddhist communities do not understand. There is a common understanding that we have as Buddhists a law that is above the law of the land where we are, and therefore we can do whatever we want, if they even think about that at all. But that is not the case. So when survivors come to me, they rarely start with, I really want to sue these people. In fact, they say, the only reason I'm doing this is because I don't want it to happen to anybody else. And as I said, they've often tried to bring change and been re-traumatized and shunned. In those cases, the law becomes a tool for them, not for vengeance. A lot of people think this is about getting even. But for the people that I represent, that is not the case. It is not for money, although money is what is available through the civil justice system, and that's about it, is money. They don't do it for that, though. They don't do it to put somebody into prison, which is, as I'll say in a minute or two, about the criminal justice system. But they do it for validation, and because they were silenced, and because the truth was never able to be told. So let's talk about what the law. Now, I'm going to focus here obviously on US law, but generally these systems that I'm going to talk about are there in most, at least Western cultures. So there are several legal pathways, and I'm going to talk about the civil lawsuits using the civil justice system, criminal lawsuits, again, the criminal justice system, and the use of in the United States, what are called human trafficking laws, which doesn't sound like it would apply to Buddhism, but stay with me here because I'm going to show you how it does. So first of all, civil lawsuits. So we have laws that don't have to do with put people in prison. They are civil claims, and you can file a claim. And most frequently in my practice, it is for sexual assault, it is for negligence. And so I want to talk about both of those two things. And by the way, all of these claims, and this is a problem for us in the legal world representing survivors, all of these claims have an expiration date. And so often, as we know, it takes years for survivors of spiritual trauma to come to an understanding of what happened to them. And while that is happening, the expiration date of being able to go to a civil lawsuit is expiring, and oftentimes has already expired. Several states in the United States have abolished statutes of limitations in assault cases. Some of them have opened what they call revival windows, which allows old claims. That means that harm from decades ago can sometimes still be brought to court. I recently settled a case for a group of women who'd sued a teacher in a monastery for abuse that happened 25 years ago. And the lawsuit wasn't, again, about money, although they received money. And I am of the firm opinion that money is necessary as a reparation, first as an acknowledgement that there was harm and that there was damage, and that money is often the only thing that can be given in order to settle and balance out the harm, because it costs money to have therapy and to do the things that are necessary for recovery. So in this case, the lawsuit, again, wasn't about money, although there was money. It was about naming what happened. And this woman said, and I quote, "I felt so powerful that I was able to bring the teacher and the organization who harmed me to the door of the courthouse on their knees. And for the first time, that the Sangha had to face the truth in public. The process would not allow them to silence me." In fact, the shunning and the retaliation by the Sangha had been as devastating, and this is something that I find, and I imagine that Anne and Amy have found it too. I have many, many clients who've been raped, and rape is a serious, serious thing to have happen to you. The trauma is enormous. But I have clients who will tell me that what happened from the organization that retaliated, shunned, silenced is as traumatic as the rape itself. And so in a civil lawsuit, you can sue the organization that silenced you, particularly when they were aware or should have been aware of what was happening. And believe me, most of these organizations are aware of what is happening. So that's the civil side. There's a criminal possibility. These are less common. I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I don't see these. But there are a great deal more of these against religious teachers and cult leaders than there were just a decade ago. It's difficult, more difficult to bring these claims because the survivor doesn't have their own lawyer. They have a government appointed prosecutor in the criminal justice system. But the end result is if the survivor is successful, it means prison for the perpetrator. Um, and in the criminal court, it is not possible to bring a claim against the organization. Very few of these criminal lawsuits, I know of none, I would say, in the United States in which a Buddhist teacher has gone to jail. There are lots of problems with the criminal justice system, at least in the United States. Just rape. I mean, we're not talking about rape within spiritual communities, but only a very small percentage of rapes are ever prosecuted to conclusion in a court of law with a jury. The third thing I want to talk about in terms of legal pathways is the Trafficking Act. This is a US law, so it will not be the same as where many of you are in different countries. But it goes like this. It encompasses sex trafficking and forced labor. So let me start with forced labor because I think that's a little bit easier to understand. Many of the clients that I have been in retreat centers, temples, monasteries, ashrams that have been coerced into unpaid labor, years of unpaid labor, cleaning, cooking, building, under spiritual coercion. Under US law, under the Federal Trafficking Act, and many state laws as well, that can qualify as forced labor. And a word about trafficking, because even many lawyers don't recognize this or understand this. Trafficking is a word that makes it sound like, and we think in kind of our general understanding, that it's moving people across either international boundaries or state lines. But that is not the case. And so I'm not going to go into a big, kind of legal discussion of what that actually means. But it is enough to say that if there is coercion or fraud, if there is sexual assault, there cannot be consent if there is enough coercion. So when I see clients, when I talk to people who want to bring a claim, there are a lot of lawyers who would say, well, you consented under the theory that you didn't fight back, you didn't say no. But the reality is that people in these circumstances are coerced and they do not have the opportunity to actually willingly give their consent. So our job as lawyers in those cases is to show the court and the jury that the coercion made consent not a possibility. So again, an example of this is a woman who worked 16-hour days for many, many years without pay, believing and knowing that, first of all, believing that complaining would damage her karma, knowing that she would be thrown out if she complained, and after a certain amount of years of free labor, the laborers have no money to be able to get out. And so it becomes more like slavery than labor. She felt that what she was doing, and she was taught that what she was doing was gaining some kind of enlightenment. But instead, all too commonly, she was funding the lifestyle of the Lama and the Rinpoche. The Trafficking Act allowed her to reclaim not only her dignity and what she knew somewhere in her body and her mind was not right all along, but it allowed her to get back the money that she would have earned. Oh, and by the way, with interest. So what she said is, I know that what happened to me wasn't devotion, it was exploitation. So Let's talk for a minute about defamation. Again, this is US law, but survivors often fear legal retaliation for speaking out because Buddhist communities and other cult organizations are very, very quick to send cease and desist letters accusing survivors of defamation. So defamation is saying something that isn't true that harms another person's reputation. Truth is a defense. So, in the United States and in other countries, by the way, so is speaking out on matters of public concern. So, there are laws that protect survivors from being sued simply for telling their stories. And these laws differ by state, and I imagine they are different in other countries, but they are powerful tools to keep silence from being weaponized. Because to me, personally, it is painful to think that after deciding to give up being silenced, that a legal tool could be used against you by the organization that silenced you for years to try to silence you again. We have, by the way, one, at least one is on appeal, but we have won a case in New York where the organization, not a Buddhist organization though, sued the women who came forward for defamation and lost. And now they're appealing. I feel certain that that is going to also be upheld on appeal. So there is hope there. So Anne and Amy have talked a little bit about the things that I thank you for the plug, by the way, on my, I listened with curiosity as to what I had said that people should have, but I think that they're all as true now as they were whenever I said that. But what could sanghas who have been successfully sued, and there are now a number of them who understand the pain that they could have prevented. And there are all of the things that Anne and Amy said, but particularly a whole general category of internal accountability and governance. The difficulty with Buddhism and the difficulty in making any cultural change is that there is no norm for that. Because if we have a person who is all knowing, then we cannot hold them accountable. So that again is all of those things. There will be a reckoning someday in Buddhism worldwide, that because of survivors who have not been silenced or will not remain silenced, because of allies who will not be silenced, that there will be a reckoning that happens in these communities as more and more of them face the pain of lawsuits. So the best sanghas that I've seen are those that bring in outside professionals. They issue transparent findings, they do an investigation, they commit to survivor-centered reforms. These are not legal requirements. But at the same time, you are more at risk of legal action if you do not have these things in place. So pathways, those law opportunities, civil justice system, criminal justice system, are not the whole story. Law is really just a framework. It opens the door. But the real transformation comes when survivors decide to give up silence, to tell their stories, and walk through the door and find some kind of healing community, some kind of repair waiting on the other side. So, survivor power. Let's talk about what that is. What happens when that silence that has been so carefully constructed breaks, not just individually, but collectively. And I hope that that is what is happening now, that collectively, as we see one person strong enough to stand up and tell what has happened to them, that it triggers others to say, I could do the same. So when survivors have done that, I have seen them form their own kind of sanghas, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes in person, like the Heartwood group, sometimes online, like the Facebook groups. They come together to speak the truth, to take refuge again, but this time not in a teacher, but in each other and in the truth of what they have had happen to them. That, to me, is the purest form of the three jewels. If you are a practitioner who looks at the three jewels, Buddha as the awakening within each survivor, Dharma as the truth, even when the truth is painful, inconvenient, but harmful, Sangha as community that witnesses and supports and does not silence. That's survivor power. That's what happens when people eventually are able to feel that they can give up silence and tell what's true. When that happens, communities too can reclaim their integrity. We don't see it happen very often, but when a Sangha admits harm, apologizes not performatively, but compassionately and from the heart, when they create new structures for accountability, I believe that they are performing a spiritual act and that they are making that truth visible. And all of you out there in the LGBTQ communities, you have a special wisdom here. You know what it means to transform shame into pride, secrecy into solidarity. That same alchemy can heal Buddhist spaces too, if we collectively can come together and through a lot of different means, a lot of different tools. The law is just one that we can collectively make Buddhism better for everyone, no matter what their gender, their race, their sexual identity. So, to the survivors that are listening today in this room or on Zoom, I know that there are probably many. To the allies, of which there are so many, I want to say, you are not a threat to the Dharma. You are the renewal of Dharma. Your truth telling is not divisive. It is, in fact, the first step toward liberation, both for survivors and also for Buddhism, because this is just my personal opinion, but ultimately, Buddhism cannot survive in the West unless it reforms. So, where does this leave us as practitioners, as communities, as allies, as people of conscience? If silence was the problem, then speech is the beginning of healing, but not just any speech. In Buddhism, we have the concept of right speech, speech that's truthful, purposeful, courageous. So, my call to action for all of us today is listen when survivors speak without rushing to defend the teacher or the institution. Just listen. Learn what the law can do for survivors positively, for Buddhist leaders in a negative way, because this is not as a threat, but it can act as a tool for justice and safety, and it often doesn't end well for Buddhist communities. Lead your communities toward transparency and inclusion. And if you are a survivor, whether or not you choose to pursue a legal case, sit in your own truth and tell your story when you are ready. Know that you are already doing the most radical thing possible. You are breaking the silence. Truth is the foundation of liberation. I have I have a poster that says, "The proclamation of the truth is fearless. It is the lion's roar." So when survivors and allies speak that truth, the Dharma makes itself heard and will roar. Thank you.